Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show, where we look at two new books on Scottish history, one fact and one fiction. Scotland may be a small nation, but it has a large history, real and imagined. From Hollywood blockbusters such as Brigadoon and Braveheart, to the Amazon Prime treatment of Outlander, the facts and folklore of Scotland have been spun and respun for each eager generation. We look today at the first in a trilogy of novels from Andrew MacLeod, which gives the 18th century travels of Dr. Johnson and his companion, the diarist James Bothwell, a supernatural twist. However, why dwell just in fiction when the factual base of Scottish history is dramatic and exciting? But much of the real history of Scotland is hidden, perhaps even suppressed. The stories untold save in academic tomes. One such episode is the radical rising of 1820, and Alex will be speaking to journalist and historian Murray Armstrong about his new book on Scotland's first fight for democracy. But first, to your tweets, emails and messages in response to our show last week on the future of Northern Ireland. First, Hugh Fraser says, "This is my first visit to the Alex Salmond Show. I'm very impressed. He allowed the interviewee to speak without interruption or contradiction. He also kept his own views to himself. Yes, I'll be back. Thanks." Well, thank you, Hugh. William Moore says, "Johnson and the Conservative and Unionist Party have thrown the Northern Ireland Unionists under a bus. So long as he got the Brexit his paymasters wanted. United Ireland in a few decades," he says. Alan says, "Perhaps if some folk in favour of remaining part of the UK begin to be negatively affected by Brexit, they'll look to Brussels via Dublin for a stable, prosperous future." Louise says of Baroness Hoey, "So as a Brexiteer, she's probably voted for the Withdrawal Act, thereby implicitly repealing any conflicting part of their Act of Union, which she's now happy about. Sounds like she didn't think ahead." And finally, Gordon McIntosh says, "About time Ireland was reunified and Scotland free." Now, given that the historical novel was invented by Sir Walter Scott, it's hardly surprising that Scotland's story has been a rich vein for such work. Ah, Scotland, the land of whisky and tartan. Home to clan history and lots of sheep, and most importantly, a country with a deep history of literature. Some of the world's most famous authors and novels were birthed or were centred in the history of Scotland. Robert Louis Stevenson, Virginia Woolf, J.M. Barrie, Alexander McCall Smith, and legions of others. And what's more, the country is stunningly beautiful, so it's no wonder that people love books set in Scotland. More recently, Diana Gabaldon's Outlander started a whole new modern Scottish fascination movement. Into this genre comes a brand new book by Andrew MacLeod with a supernatural theme, The Fall of the House of Thomas Weir. Alex interviews the author.
Andrew MacLeod, welcome to the Alex Salmond Show.
Thanks for having me, Alex. It's a real pleasure and a privilege.
This new book, The Fall of the House of Thomas Weir, this takes historical events, Dr. Johnson, James Bothwell, the diarist, the late 18th century, and gives them a supernatural twist. What on earth were you thinking of to come up with such a formula?
Well, it was a very simple idea when I was reading Sherlock Holmes one day, and one of the stories, I think it was a Scandal in Bohemia, where Sherlock Holmes calls Watson the Boswell to his Johnson. And apart from, there's lots of other influences, but that was the key that gave me the idea of these two characters as a kind of supernatural investigators.
Well, so the real life Dr. Johnson and James Boswell, I mean, the late 18th century, they embark on a tour of Scotland. Dr. Johnson, the famous literist, English nationalist, had a pretty poor view of the Scots. But Boswell, his great Scottish friend, was a considerable figure in his own right, a literary figure, not just a diarist, but a whole range of things. So what made you think, well, I'll take them on their tour to Edinburgh, in rational Scotland of the Enlightenment, and give it a supernatural twist?
Well, the Enlightenment era, Edinburgh is a fascinating chapter in history, and it's not taught in schools enough, I don't think. When I went to school, we did the Industrial Revolution, and to me that was a bit, it was kind of boring to me, all about farming implements and innovations in agriculture. We should have been learning about the Scottish Enlightenment. What a fascinating chapter in history that was. Actually, Alex, you remind me of one of these characters, and I mean that in a nice way, because It was a time of a lot of visionaries, progressive thinkers. It was a time when even the judges and the lawyers were philosophers and passionately concerned with justice. But also it was a time of superstition. Edinburgh is the haunted capital of the world, really. So it's a great crossroads. On one side, you've got the age of reason. On the other side, you've got all the ghost stories and the supernatural elements. So it just seemed perfect to centre Johnson and Boswell in that era.
I'm dying to ask you this question, Andrew. When I was working in the Scottish Parliament, in fact, the old building in the Scottish Parliament up the top of the mount, and I'd be working there late on a Friday night, and all of a sudden I'd hear shrieks and cries, and I actually phoned the police once, and it turned out to be the Edinburgh ghost tours. People, big visitors, tourists being frightened out of their lives by going up the closes and alleyways and wynds and underground passages of old Edinburgh town. Was one of your inspirations? Did you go on the ghost tour to get the setting of your book right?
Well, I have visited Mary King's Close, yeah. I mean, it's the city of Edinburgh. I really miss it at the moment, by the way. It's a fabulous place. It's full of history. It's a very vibrant city. And if you go along the high street and go into Mary King's, you can actually, underneath the old town is the older part. There's a whole subterranean area where there's... In 1645, during the Great Plague, they were bricked over. It was a really tragic tale, but a lot of the people who had the plague and the sick and the healthy were bricked up together. So underneath the high street is a perfectly preserved system of underground closes and tenement basements that you can still visit to this day. So in my book, obviously, I use this as a kind of a underworld for the supernatural.
And were you thinking ahead to a television or a cinema version of this where you'll have a ready-made set? Is that in your mind, Andrew? Come on, tell the truth.
You don't like to think that far ahead, but certainly I did see the commercial appeal of it with shows like Penny Dreadful. And I actually have had an interest, just early stages, but from one of the writers at a top Netflix show has shown interest in reading the book.
Well, good luck in that, Andrew. But tell us a bit about who is the fall of the house of Thomas Weir? I mean, who is the person whose house has fallen? I mean, where does he fit into the book?
Well, Thomas Weir, a.k.a. the Warlock of West Bow, was a pious Presbyterian. And people came from miles around to hear him preach. He was a very pious and holy man. But behind closed doors, it was another matter entirely. He and his sister Griselle, apparently they lived in incestuous, sinful relationship. And there was a lot of black masses went on behind their closed doors. And...
So it was this grisly past that your characters or characterisation of Dr. Johnson and James Boswell set to uncover about a century later. Was that's the key to the book, is it?
Exactly, yeah. Of course, Thomas Weir was 100 years before the events in the book, but his house still stood at that time on West Bow, which is that steep hill between the High Street and the Grassmarket. I think there's a Quakers church there now. But there was a recent article that some of the old house, they found a wall from the old house I think it was in the bathroom of the Quakers church. But yeah, it was 100 years before Thomas Weir lived, and he was executed for his witchcraft and his crimes. But his spirit still lives on, and the house is the centre for all sorts of paranormal activity that you'll find out if you read the book.
And of course, the great thing about starting off with this is that the casebook of Johnson and Boswell, rather like the casebook of Holmes and Watson, it can run for a range. So you've got some more episodes in mind, I understand. Is that right?
Oh, I did the second book, so almost finished, the Johnson and Boswell and the Stone of Destiny. And that's going to be a kind of mix of Indiana Jones and the Da Vinci Code by way of Holmes and Watson, where they go after the real Stone of Destiny, because, as you may know, when Longshanks was heading north, he had 3 months when he was invading Scotland.
Well, we better stop there for a second. I mean, this is your second book, but the Stone of Destiny was Scotland's ancient relic which was the kings and queens, or kings actually, of Scotland that were crowned in Scone, and Edward Longshanks, King of England, Scotland, rapaciously stole it from Scotland in the 1290s, and it resided in Westminster Abbey right up until the 1950s when a bunch of Scottish nationalists pinched it back to Scotland. And a few years ago it was restored back to Scotland, and it's now actually, I think, going to be shown in Perth soon. It's been in Edinburgh Castle for a while. So there's this stone of mystery that's going to be the centrepiece of your second book. Is that right?
Yeah, that's the MacGuffin. But they have all sorts of historical adventures. They have a run-in with the Wolf of Badenoch, and they go to St Kilda where they meet the ghost of Lady Grange, and they finish in Iona where they go visit the graveyard of kings. So there's all kinds of... I've taken all the supernatural stories of Scotland on this tour they go on. It's kind of like a road novel. It's episodic, but there's an overarching quest for the Stone of Destiny.
So, Andrew, can I ask you this question? I mean, obviously, you're in a fine tradition started by Walter Scott, the historical novel. But recently it has been, with the great successes like Outlander, being given this sort of supernatural twist. So do you regard your books as being in that tradition of Scottish fiction with fact woven in? And do you think that helps in the understanding of Scottish history?
That's a great question, Alex. Yeah, I mean, I first got interested in Scottish history, like I say, not at school, but when I first picked up Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson and the adventures of Alan Breck and young Davy Balfour used to really excite me and get my blood going. And from that, I took an interest in, the Jacobite cause, and that led to me reading all the Waverley novels by Walter Scott. And he's got a reputation, for some reason, for being a stuffy writer. BBC are always dramatising Jane Austen and the Bronte sisters. Goodness knows why they haven't picked up Walter Scott, because his books are thrilling, exciting adventures. And I think it's about time we had a resurgence of interest in Walter Scott's writing.
Will people, when they read your book and the other books in that genre, do you think they say, right, that is a great, rollicking, supernatural tale, one that you probably shouldn't read in bed, but when plenty of lights in the room? Do you think they look upon it that way, or do you think they say, right, that's a fantastic period in Scottish history, let's learn more about it? Or both, for that matter? I mean, is there a mission behind what you're doing, or are you there to entertain?
Oh, for sure, definitely. I mean, it would be a great summer read. And it's, full of ghosts and ghouls and supernatural occurrences. But the history is there. All the events and characters are all at least loosely based. So, I mean, this is historical fantasy. A recent reviewer said they actually enjoyed Googling all the characters and events in the book. So that's the idea. I want people to Google and learn about these things and open a dialogue. So even if things are historically accurate, people are going to start talking about these things.
Well, I'll tell you a quick story, and finally, that Randall Wallace, who was the screenwriter of Braveheart, once told me that he had, in researching the book, he'd gone to the Wallace Monument in Bridge of Allen, and it's quite difficult to get to the Wallace Monument, as you should probably know, in terms of the road layout. And he'd asked a group of young kids, how do I get to the Wallace Monument? And they said, oh, it's up that road, mister, turn right when you get up the road. And he said to them, who was William Wallace? This was back in the early 1990s, and not one of them knew the answer. And there and then, Randall Wallace said to me that he vowed that by the time he'd finished with Braveheart, that every child in Scotland, and many children across the world, would know who William Wallace was. Is that the sort of aim you've got for your series of books?
Well, perhaps not so lofty, but certainly if Angus McFadden's listening, I'm wanting to do an audio version. He would be the ideal. He's one of the best actors of his generation. He'd certainly be my top choice. But I just want people to read the book and enjoy it for what it is. And if it takes off, that would be fantastic.
Well, in my new role as recruiting business for the Bruce, I'll make sure that McFadden gets your message. Andrew, congratulations on the book, and many, many thanks indeed for joining me on the Alex Salmond Show.
An absolute pleasure. You're head and shoulders above the rest, Alex. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Join us after the break when Alex moves from fiction to fact, from popular novel to hidden history. We'll see you then. Welcome back. For a country which has had its history told and retold, It's a surprising fact that a number of key episodes have been effectively written out of conventional accounts. A former associate editor of The Guardian turned historian has been putting matters to rights. His latest volume is on the radical wars of 1820.
Murray Armstrong, you had a formidable career in journalism. Did you just turn to Scotland's radical history after your time in the Guardian and other journalistic pursuits?
Well, essentially I did. I had come across the story of Thomas Muir and the whole of the radical movement in Scotland while I was still a journalist, but I just didn't have time to do it then. It's something that's just in the footnotes of history books, in little corners of history books, and the whole story of the radical movement of the 1790s right up into the 1820s just hadn't been told.
Now, your latest volume on the radical wars of 1820, is the term radical wars, is that not a bit of an exaggeration? You know, there were a few skirmishes which the dragoons put down, they deported some people, they strung other people up, and that was basically it, was it not?
Well, that was it as far as the military action went, but the preparation behind it was far more serious than that. There were people making pikes right across the country. There were links being made with similar radicals in the north of England. There was an underground organisation because political activity had been outlawed at the time. And so, yeah, there was, in a sense, preparation for a war taking place.
Now, this was at a time, let's set the context of this. This is post-Napoleonic Wars.
Yes.
There was unrest going on across Britain, obviously the Peterloo Massacre about the same time. And basically this was what skilled working class artisans who were looking for more representation, more democracy, more rights. Was it the root of it, or was there an economic underlying theme?
The economy and society was changing amazingly with new technology, with a new factory system being set up. And in Scotland, unlike England, it took 150 to 200 years, the development of the factory system, the new social class of ownership that went with it. In Scotland, this was all achieved in about 30 years. So it was compressed into a very, very narrow space of time. And the new cities sprouted almost overnight. Glasgow and the other industrial cities in the west of Scotland sprouted almost overnight. So there were great social challenges. And the social challenges obviously had to be answered in a political fashion. You do need a political program to deal with new social challenges. And one of the programs at the time, in terms of in the minds of ordinary people, was if only we could get representation in Westminster by the likes of us, then we could sort our problems, because the aristocratic government will not do it for us.
So it's very interesting. I mean, the radicals of 1820 marched under a banner, Scotland free or a desert, which sounds pretty nationalist in its undertones, you know, a claim for Scotland, but actually they were linked to a movement taking place in England as well. How do you reconcile the nationalism, the overt nationalism, with the sort of pan-British aims of the organisation?
I don't think the two things are contradictory. The radicals in Scotland marched with symbols, with stories of their heroes, with bagpipes and bands and tartans and thistles and all the other symbols of national identity. They talked of heroes like Wallace and Bruce at their meetings. But similarly in England, the English radicals were marching with ideas of the Bill of Rights, the Glorious Revolution, all of their symbols and heroes that referred to their culture as well. So I don't think there was a contradiction. I think there was a great desire to protect national identity at the time, because everyone was afraid that Scotland was just going to be eaten up as part of North Britain, and that the whole culture of Scotland would disappear because England and the English Empire, as it had been up until very shortly before this time, England and the English Empire just seemed to be eating up everything all over the world.
And what was actually behind it? I mean, was this just a demonstration for greater parliamentary rights, or was it an incipient revolution, which is what the authorities thought it was?
It was both of those things. The authorities would see a demand for representation as being revolutionary anyway. It would undermine the society that they were in charge of at the time. And especially when women were involved, this was upsetting the social order completely. It is a fact that at Peterloo, at the massacre in Manchester in August of 1819, women were proportionally much more likely to be wounded or killed by the yeomanry's sabres than men were. Because although the men detested the ideas of reform, they detested the idea of women upsetting the social order even more than that.
And turning to the Scottish 1820 Rising, the ringleaders, Baird, Wilson, Hardy, what happened to them?
Well, in a sense, they were scapegoats rather than ringleaders. They played relatively minor parts in the Rising. As the Attorney General at the time said, that the ringleaders have all escaped, and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people did escape, many to America and Canada, or to Ireland, or they kind of got buried in the English counties somewhere and hid. But these three men were taken and they were hanged and beheaded, and their heads were held up by the axeman who declared, "This is the head of a traitor."
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty vicious stuff. I mean, this is only 200 years ago. I mean, were the authorities really that frightened that they had to use such repressive measures, or was it just some Lord Advocate using a bit of literal overkill?
No, I think they were genuinely frightened. They could see that there were big changes taking place. There was a huge radical movement both in England and in Scotland. There was a radical movement in Ireland as well, and as you know, that was dealt with in a very, very different way from, or in a more severe way than the radical movements were dealt with in England and Scotland. It was a time of revolution as well. People had fought or been taken into the army to they were told, fight for the liberty of Europe. And they saw, after the defeat of Napoleon, they saw the reintroduction of the monarchies of Europe. They felt as if they had been fighting for nothing. There was a revolution in Spain, which overthrew the king who had actually been put there by the British forces after Wellington's victory in Spain. This was the kind of thing that they saw. There were revolutions a little bit later on in the Italian kingdoms and various other places throughout Europe. So it was a revolutionary period, and I think they were genuinely afraid that something dreadful was going to happen to them.
And then the big question, Murray, how does this stuff get written out of history? I mean, how could I go through my entire schooling as somebody interested in history and not get taught a word about the 1820 Rising? But the first time I can remember talking about it was when I had a debate, a rather fractious debate, with Professor Norman Gash at St Andrews University, who thought that the 1820s were a time of total peace and contentment, the great Peelite historian. And I reminded him about the 1820 Rising. He didn't take too kindly to that. So how can you get such a huge event, series of events, written out of history? Is it deliberate suppression?
I think there is a deliberate suppression of those ideas, and they were kept alive, not just with an oral tradition, but by organisations who kept these people and these memories alive. That when the 1832 Reform Act, the first Reform Act, was passed, then the huge demonstrations in Glasgow and Edinburgh carried banners referring to Baird and Hardy and Wilson. banners referring to Thomas Muir and his compatriots in the earlier part of the radical movement. And then the Chartists in Scotland kept this alive. And it was later on, it was the Independent Labour Party, it was the Labour Party, then from the 1960s onward, the Scottish National Party. It took political parties composed of ordinary people to keep these memories alive and to keep the story, the narrative being told.
And finally, and very briefly, is this something that should be in a module in the non-curriculum of Scotland? Should there be some appreciation of this in Scottish schools so that the people can find out what their ancestors were up to and battling for rights that we now take for granted? I
think that probably should. I'm not certain what the history curriculum is in schools in Scotland at the moment. Certainly when I went to school, which was a long, long time ago, you know, we would get a wee bit of Bonnie Prince Charlie, and then the rest would be about the British Empire. And I doubt if that's how the curriculum is structured at the moment. But I think, as you yourself said when you were First Minister, that it would be fantastic to have Thomas Muir and the other radicals, which would mean the radicals of the 1820s as well, written into the curriculum in Scottish schools.
And so say all of us. Murray Armstrong, author of The Radical Rising of 1820, The Radical Wars, Scotland's first fight for democracy. Thank you for joining me on the Alex Salmond Show.
Thank you.
The writer Richard Sheridan called Scotland's Celtic neighbour Ireland the land of happy wars and sad love songs. Scotland's story has launched 1,000 novels, often of forlorn love, set against a romantic past, but the sharper edges of historical facts have often been erased from memory. All the more reason to rediscover these events, the suppressed radical history of this remarkable country. We might well find that Scotland's fact is even more potent than Scotland's fiction. And so for now, from Alex, myself and all at the show, it's goodbye, stay safe, and we hope to see you all again next week.